There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when power walks through the door. Not the silence of reverence. Not the silence of fear, exactly, though fear is present. It is something older than either of those things. It is the silence of a room full of calculating people who have suddenly remembered that they are small. She did not know that silence yet. She would learn it. Miss Violet Ashworth stood in the back corner of Carrington's debt auction house on a cold Tuesday morning in October of 1814, wearing a grey dress that had been let out at the seams twice, holding a leather satchel that contained the sum total of her legal arguments, her last 3 shillings, and a folded letter she had written to her father at 2 o'clock that morning, that she could not afford to post. She had come to beg. She knew it was begging. She had made her peace with that on the coach ride over, when she had carefully removed her pride and folded it into a small square and placed it at somewhere it would not embarrass her. A woman in her situation could not afford pride. She had learned that lesson slowly, and then all at once, the way one learns most of the important lessons in life. Her father, Viscount Ashworth of Somerset, had been in Marshalsea prison for 11 months. His estate had been seized 18 months before that. His title remained. One could not seize a title, which Violet had always found a particularly cruel irony, since a title without land or money was nothing more than a label on an empty bottle. What remained was the cottage, a small, ivy-covered stone house on 3 acres in Somerset, where Violet had learned to read, where her mother had died, where the roses climbed the south wall every June without being asked. It was the only thing that had not yet been taken. Today it would be taken, unless she could stop it. She pressed her spectacles up her nose with 2 fingers and looked at the auctioneer, a small man with the expression of someone who had long ago decided that human suffering was simply the weather of his profession, unchangeable and not worth remarking upon. She had spoken to him before the room filled. He had been polite. He had been immovable. The cottage would be sold. She had 45 minutes left to find a reason it should not be. She was still searching for that reason when the door opened and the silence arrived. Before we step into Chapter 1, if this opening has already reached you, do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. It takes 3 seconds and it means more stories like this one keep coming. Now, let us go back to Violet. She has 44 minutes left and the door has just opened. Chapter 1, Violet. The man who walked in was not what she expected a ruin to look like. She had imagined, in her weaker moments, that the Duke of Ashmore would be elderly. Corpulent, perhaps, red-faced in the manner of men who had eaten too well for too many years. She had imagined he would smell of pipe tobacco and self-satisfaction, and the particular arrogance of a man who had never had to consider whether his cruelty was visible. He was none of those things. He was tall in a way that rearranged the geometry of the room around him. Dark-haired, though she was too far away to see the precise shade. Broad across the shoulders in a way his excellently tailored coat did nothing to conceal, and everything to emphasize. He moved without hurry, which was its own kind of statement. A man who knows the auction will not begin until he is ready. Violet did not know yet that this was the Duke of Ashmore. She knew only that the room had changed. The tobacco smoke still hung in grey ribbons near the ceiling. The wigs of the older solicitors still powdered the air faintly. The creditors still clustered in their groups, sharp-eyed and patient as birds, waiting on a fence. But they had all, imperceptibly, adjusted their positions, turned slightly, leaned fractionally closer to whoever stood beside them to murmur something. The auction house had been rearranged around this man's entrance the way iron filings are rearranged around a magnet. You could not quite see the force, but you could see its effect on everything near it. He did not look around the room. He looked at the auctioneer's platform with the direct attention of a man who had come for one specific purpose and intended to accomplish it efficiently. Then, as if he had already completed some calculation she was not party to, he looked directly at her. Violet did not flinch. She had learned, in the past 3 years, not to flinch. Flinching cost something she could not spare. But the look was extraordinary. Not predatory, as she might have expected. Not dismissive, as she was accustomed to, from men of obvious wealth and position, encountering a woman in a let-out grey dress. It was something more unsettling than either. It was a look of recognition. She had never seen this man before in her life. She was certain of it. And yet he looked at her the way one looks at someone whose voice one has heard in the dark, as though the face were merely a neft, confirmation of something already known. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away, because holding the gaze of powerful strangers at debt auctions was not, she had concluded, the sort of behavior that would assist her cause. The auction began. The auctioneer, reinvigorated by the arrival of this evident wealth, straightened his spine and produced his gavel with renewed enthusiasm. Lot 17 was described. A Somerset cottage, stone-built, 3 acres, sound roof, good water. The roses on the south wall were not mentioned. The desk near the window where Violet had first read Shakespeare was not mentioned. The way the light fell through the kitchen window every morning in a way that had made her mother stop, sometimes mid-task, just to stand in, not mentioned. The bidding was not spirited. The cottage was modest. The first offer came from a man in brown wool, who Violet had been watching. A land agent, she thought, working for someone with Somerset interests. The second came from a solicitor she did not recognize. She had spent the coach ride composing her appeal. She opened her mouth. The man with the extraordinary stillness raised 2 fingers. The room stopped. The auctioneer looked at him, looked at the other bidders, looked at his gavel. 3 words, sold to Ashmore, and the thing was done. Violet stood in the corner and felt the floor shift beneath her feet in a way that was not physical. She had known, intellectually, that this was the likely outcome. She had known it on the coach, had known it when she rose at 5 o'clock to dress in the grey gown that announced to every person who saw her exactly what category of woman she was. She had known it, and she had come anyway, because the alternative to coming had been staying in her rented room doing nothing, and Violet Ashworth was constitutionally incapable of doing nothing, when action, however futile, remained possible. But knowing a thing and experiencing a thing are different rooms in the same terrible house. The cottage was gone. Her father's last asset, the last thread of the life they had lived before the ruin, the roses on the south wall, gone. Sold to Ashmore in 2 raised fingers and 3 words. She became aware, slowly, of a secondary problem. The way one becomes aware of a second fire only after the first has already taken the roof. She had no income. The position she had been holding as governess to the Whitmore family had ended 3 weeks prior, when Mrs. Whitmore, learning the full particulars of Violet's family situation, had concluded, with profound regret and a 6-day severance payment, that the association was no longer suitable. Violet had been surviving on that severance and the careful management of 2 shillings a day. She had been counting on the auction not proceeding, or proceeding in a way that left her some negotiating ground, some arrangement, something. She had nothing now. No position, no income, no family home, and precisely 2 shillings and 4pence remaining in her satchel. She looked at the man who had just bought the last of her world. He was speaking quietly to a secretary, a young man with an anxious face and an ink-stained cuff who was scribbling rapidly. The Duke of Ashmore, for she had heard his name said by 3 different mouths in the room since that gavel fell, did not look triumphant. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man completing a task on a list. That was almost the worst thing about it. She did not stay to watch the other lots sold. She walked out of Carrington's auction house into the October cold with her satchel and her 2 shillings and the letter she could not post. And she stood on the pavement while the city moved around her with its magnificent indifference, and she thought, well, what now? Chapter 2. Adrian. He had not expected her to be there. That was the first thing Adrian Blackwell, 5th Duke of Ashmore, said to himself when he saw her standing in the back corner of Carrington's. Though said to himself was perhaps too mild a phrase. The thought arrived with the force of something thrown. She is here. He knew her immediately, which was not remarkable. He had read enough of her letters to know her without introduction. But knowing a voice and seeing a face he was discovering this with some discomfort. Profoundly different experiences. Her letters had told him she was composed under pressure, facing the near-total destruction of her family's finances, her only remaining parent in a debtor's prison, her own employment precarious. She had written to her father with a steadiness that he had found. Initially, merely interesting, and then, over 2 months of intercepted correspondence, something closer to humbling. I am well, father. The rooms are small, but the light is good in the afternoons. I have been rereading your copy of Milton, the one with your notes in the margins, which I confess I find more illuminating than the poem itself, since your quarrels with the text are considerably more spirited than his poetry merits. I miss your voice. I do not say this to grieve you, but because it is true, and I have decided that truth, even when it costs something, is the only currency I have left that no one can take from me. He had read that particular letter 4 times. He had told himself, when he first began intercepting the correspondence, that it was as intelligent. He was a man of careful and thorough information gathering. He had known, going into the destruction of Viscount Ashworth's finances, that there was a daughter. He had made the decision that the daughter was likely complicit in the comfortable life, built on fraudulent investment returns. Most families of that kind were collectively comfortable. They did not question the source of the comfort. He had been wrong about that, and the letters had dismantled his assumption over 8 weeks with the quiet efficiency of water on stone. The 3rd letter had contained this. I have been thinking about the nature of debt, father, and I find I do not entirely agree with the law's interpretation of it. There is financial debt, which is a matter of paper and ledgers and men in wigs making solemn pronouncements. And there is the other kind, which is not written anywhere. The debt of one person to another, for the sheer fact of being witnessed, being known, being loved. That second kind no court can call in. It may be the only thing that cannot be seized. He had been standing at his study window when he read that one, and he had remained standing there for considerably longer than he intended. He was not, by nature or by practice, a man given to sentiment. He had spent 15 years building a financial empire on the ruins of his own father's grief, and the machinery of that enterprise required exactly the kind of cold precision that sentiment corroded. He had known what he was doing when he called in Ashworth's debts. He had known it was devastating. He had intended it to be devastating. Lord Ashworth had taken his father's entire remaining fortune, through a fraudulent investment scheme in 1799, a scheme so elaborate and so convincing that his father, a gentle, trusting man who had loved music and gardens and his son with equal, uncomplicated fervency, had signed every document placed before him without suspicion. His father had died 2 years later. Not from the poverty alone, though the poverty was real and grinding and stripped everything of comfort. He had died from the look in his eyes that had appeared the day he understood he had been deliberately deceived by a man he had considered a friend. That look had killed something in him that no doctor could name or treat. Adrian had been 17 years old, standing beside a modest grave in a Derbyshire churchyard, making a promise to himself that had taken 15 years to keep. He had kept it 3 months ago. Ashworth's financial position had been, by that point, so completely engineered toward collapse that calling in the debts was merely the final act of a long, precise drama. The result had been exactly what he had worked toward. The estate seized, the Viscount imprisoned for fraud, the family name reduced to a liability. He had been satisfied for approximately 6 weeks. Then the letters had started reviving. He looked at her now, standing in the back of Carrington's with her spine very straight, and her hands clasped around her satchel, and her wire-rimmed spectacles pushed up, her nose in a gesture he recognized. She did it, he had noticed, when she was working hard to remain composed. He had pieced that together from context across multiple letters. I have been holding myself very still today, or I find stillness the most useful armor I own. She was not tall, but she stood as though she had made a private agreement with the space around her. Her hair was dark brown and pinned with the careful economy of a woman who has learned to appear presentable on limited means. Her face was not beautiful in the conventional porcelain manner that London society demanded. She was softer-featured, fuller-cheeked, with eyes behind her spectacles that even at this distance appeared to see things clearly. When she held his gaze for those 3 seconds, he felt something move in him that he did not have a name for and did not wish to examine. He raised his fingers. He bought the cottage. He heard the gavel. She walked out. He spent the next 40 seconds completing a transaction with the auctioneer's secretary that he could have delegated entirely to his own man but did not, because he needed those 40 seconds to make a decision. "Alderton," he said to his secretary, who materialized at his elbow with his usual nervous efficiency. "Your Grace, Miss Violet Ashworth. She will be in need of lodging as of this evening." He did not look up from signing the transfer document. "Find something appropriate. Respectable street, reasonable comfort, not ostentatious. Have it arranged before 5 o'clock, and have the first month's rent paid through the Whitmore Charitable Trust account, so there is no direct connection." Alderton wrote this down without blinking. He had long since trained himself not to blink at the Duke's instructions. "And shall I? No communication from me, no note, no card, no indication of source. Simply have it available and have Mrs. Gareth at number 14 Clarges Street informed that a Miss Ashworth will be arriving." "Yes, Your Grace." He folded the transfer document. He put it in his coat. He walked out of Carrington's auction house into the October cold, and he stood for a moment on the pavement and did something he almost never did. He examined his own motives. He could not account for them. He had come here to close a chapter of 15 years. He had closed it. The cottage was his. Viscount Ashworth's last asset was now part of the Ashmore estate, and would be sold or managed according to Ashmore's interests, not Ashworth's sentiment. He had done what he came to do. There was no reasonable explanation for why he had spent 40 seconds arranging somewhere warm for Violet Ashworth to sleep tonight. He did not find a reasonable explanation. He got into his carriage, took out the most recent of her letters from the inner pocket of his coat, and read it for the third time. I wonder, sometimes, what I would say to the Duke of Ashmore if I were ever given the chance. I think I would not shout. Shouting feels like giving something to a person who does not deserve your energy. I think I would simply ask him to look at what he has done, and whether he is content with it. That is all. Whether he is content. He folded the letter. He looked out at London passing by his window, grey and indifferent. He was not content. He had not been content in some time, and he was only now, in the back of his carriage on a cold October morning, beginning to understand why. Chapter 3. Violet. The rooms at number 14 Clarges Street were not what she expected from a charitable society's provision. They were, in fact, almost alarmingly comfortable. 2 rooms on the first floor, facing south, so the afternoon light came in at an angle that struck Violet with a physical ache, because it reminded her of the kitchen at the Somerset cottage, though she did not permit herself to think about that for more than a moment. A decent fireplace, a writing desk of solid mahogany, a small bookshelf empty but waiting, linen that had been laundered with lavender water, and a landlady of the Mrs. Gareth variety, stout, efficient, not unkind, and deeply incurious, which was, perhaps, most valuable quality a landlady could possess when one's circumstances were what Violet's were. She sat at the writing desk that first evening, and she opened her satchel and took out the letter she had not been able to post. She read it back. It felt insufficient. Everything she wrote to her father these days felt insufficient, because the truth was too large for paper, and the things that needed saying were too painful for ink. She put that letter aside and began again. Dear Father, the cottage is gone. I am sorry to say it in those plain words, but I find I no longer have the energy to dress terrible things in careful language. It was sold this morning at Carrington's. I was present, and I could not stop it. I have been installed, through some charity I cannot quite trace, in comfortable rooms on Clarges Street. I am suspicious of comfort I cannot account for, as you always taught me to be, but I am also cold and tired, and the fire here is very good. I went to see Mr. Hartley, your solicitor, yesterday. He tells me the remaining legal proceedings could be stayed if, and he said this with the expression of a man who does not believe his own sentence, if someone with sufficient influence chose to intervene on your behalf. I do not know who that someone might be. I do not know what it would cost. I know only that I have not stopped looking. The roses on the south wall will have been past their best by the time anyone new sees them. I hope whoever buys the cottage next loves them anyway. I hope they do not tear them out. I am still here, Father. I am still entirely, stubbornly here. All my love, Violet. She folded the letter and sealed it and addressed it, and looked at the 2 shillings in her purse and calculated the postage and posted it anyway, because some things were more important than 2 shillings, and her father's knowledge that she had not been extinguished was one of them. She came back from the postal house and found a calling card had been placed on the tray in the entrance hall during her absence. It was cream card stock, heavy, engraved. No decoration, simply a name and a title, and beneath them in a precise hand 3 words. At your convenience. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ashmore. Violet stood in the entrance hall, holding this card, and breathed through her nose for several seconds. Mrs. Gareth appeared from the back of the house with the expression of a woman who has been practicing her neutrality. The gentleman's secretary called Miss. He said, His Grace would be grateful for a quarter-hour of your time at your convenience regarding your father's remaining legal situation. She turned the card over. The reverse was blank. She had 2 options. She could refuse. Refusing was satisfying in the way that setting fire to one's own house was satisfying. It solved the immediate emotional problem by creating a much larger practical one, or she could go. She thought about her father in Marshalsea. She thought about the word stayed from Mr. Hartley's mouth. She thought about what a man with sufficient influence might look like. She put the card in her pocket. "Please send word that I will call tomorrow at 11, she told Mrs. Gareth. She went upstairs and sat at her desk and wrote nothing for a long time. Then she wrote in her journal, a small leather-bound volume she kept locked and carried with her always, the one place she permitted herself honesty without economy. October the 14th. I am to see the Duke of Ashmore tomorrow, the architect of my father's ruin. I find I am not only frightened, I am curious, which is probably a character flaw. I want to know what kind of man looks at the wreckage of a family and calls it completed business. I want to see his face when someone who is still standing, despite everything he did, looks back at him and does not break. I am going to wear my best remaining dress. It is not very good, but I will wear it as though it were. Chapter 4. Adrian, his study had been described by 3 different people on 3 different occasions as intimidating. He had never adjusted it on this account. The dark oak paneling absorbed light as a matter of principle. The legal documents arranged in their neat rows across 2 of the 4 walls were not decoration but working record. Every financial transaction, every correspondence, every instrument of the empire he had built from the ruins of his inheritance. The desk was enormous, which was functional rather than theatrical, as it needed to hold a great deal of paper. The single window looked out onto the grey London street and admitted enough light to work by, and no more. Violet Ashworth arrived at 11 minutes past 11, which told him she had not been anxious to be early, and had also not been willing to be late. She was shown in by Alderton, who had the expression of a man watching something he did not fully understand proceed to its conclusion. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that had been pressed with care, and that sat on her figure with a quiet confidence that the dress itself did not entirely deserve. Her spectacles were straight. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were still. She looked at his study with a brief, comprehensive glance, taking in the documents, the desk, the proportions of the room, and he watched her register what the room was designed to convey and decide that she was not, on this occasion, going to be conveyed. "Miss Ashworth," he said, remaining standing. It was the courtesy that the situation demanded. "Thank you for coming. You are welcome, Your Grace." Her voice was lower than he had somehow imagined. Steady. She took the chair he indicated without being asked twice. "I understand you wish to discuss my father's legal situation." "I did." He sat. "I will be plain. The remaining proceedings against your father could be stayed, pending review, if I were to indicate to the relevant parties that new information had come to my attention warranting reconsideration." A pause. "And has it?" He did not answer that directly. "I have a proposition. I suspected you might." The faintest acknowledgement of that crossed his face. He folded his hands on the desk. "I require a hostess for the remainder of this season. My estate and townhouse have social obligations that have, in the absence of a suitable female presence, been imperfectly managed. I require someone with intelligence, composure, and the ability to navigate society at its more demanding levels. I am prepared to offer, in return for the undertaking of these duties, a stayed proceeding on your father's case and a modest but sufficient personal income." She looked at him. He had the experience, rare enough to be notable, of being looked at, rather than merely seen. "That is the proposition as you have framed it," she said. "May I ask what it actually is?" "I beg your pardon." A duke who requires a hostess could employ any number of women whose social standing would be less, potentially damaging to his reputation, than that of the daughter of a disgraced viscount. I am the least suitable candidate in London for what you claim to need. So I am curious, Your Grace, as to what you actually need. Another pause. Longer this time, he said. Carefully, the arrangement is as I have described it. The terms are the terms. Then I will add one of my own, she said, and he heard in her voice the thing he had read in her letters. The compressed fury, the controlled power of a person who has learned to put enormous force through a very small opening. If I agree to this, and I have not yet agreed, I will have unrestricted access to visit my father in Marshalsea, weekly. No escort from your household, no observation, no conditions. Agreed, he said. She blinked. Just once. She had not expected agreement without negotiation. That is, very quickly agreed, Your Grace. It is a reasonable condition. Most men of your position would consider it a concession worth extracting something for. Then perhaps, he said, and he was aware this was more than he had intended to say, I am not most men of my position. She studied him for a moment with those spectacled eyes that he was finding increasingly difficult to be under without the sensation of being read. I have one further condition, she said. I should like it understood between us, clearly and without ambiguity, that my agreement to this arrangement is on behalf of my father's welfare and nothing else. I do not forgive you, Your Grace. I do not absolve you. I am here because I have no better option. And I want you to know that I know that, and I want you to know that it changes nothing about what I think of what you have done. She had said it without heat, which was, he found, considerably more effective than shouting. Understood, he said. Then I accept the terms. She stood, which meant he had to stand, which meant the meeting was over on her timeline rather than his. He noted that this was deliberate. He found himself, against all reasonable expectation, admiring it. I will have Alderton provide the details of the arrangements, he said. You may move to Ashmore House at the end of the week. Thank you, Your Grace. She moved toward the door, paused, turned back, and there was something in the turn, the smallest shadow of something, that was not quite the composed surface she had been presenting. One question, if I may, purely practical, of course. The rooms on Clarges Street, the charitable society through which they were arranged. She looked at him with an expression that was not accusatory, but was very exact. Was that you? He met her gaze. The Whitmore Charitable Trust is a legitimate institution, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. That is not an answer to my question. No, he said, it is not. She left. He stood in his study for some time after the door closed, listening to the sound of her footsteps diminish down the hall and out into the street, and he thought, this was a profound mistake, and he was going to make it anyway, and he had made more carefully calculated decisions in his life with considerably less understanding of their consequences. Chapter 5. Violet Ashmore House was the sort of house that required an adjustment of scale before one could properly see it. Not a palace, not technically, though the entrance hall was larger than the entire ground floor of the Clarges street rooms, and the staircase swept upward in a manner that seemed designed to make one feel both impressed and slightly theatrical, as though one had wandered onto a stage without knowing one's lines. She arrived on a Friday, which she had chosen deliberately over the Saturday that Alderton had suggested. Arriving on a Friday gave her the weekend. 2 days in which the household would be conducting its normal routines without social engagements, to understand the landscape before she was required to navigate it in public. The housekeeper was a Mrs. Prentice, tall, angular, with the watchful economy of a woman who had managed this house through several changes of occupant, and had formed opinions about all of them that she kept to herself with professional discipline. She received Violet with perfect correctness and an immaculate blankness that communicated to anyone fluent in the language of household staff that no judgment had yet been formed, but that the capacity for it was fully operational. The suite she was given was on the second floor, east-facing. Good morning light, which Violet noted with genuine gratitude. The rooms were beautiful in the cool, precise way of the rest of the house. Silk curtains of deep gold, a carpet that had cost more than any single thing she owned, a writing desk that sat before the window, with an angle to the light that was actually perfect for writing. There were fresh flowers on the mantelpiece, which she found oddly touching, because no one had put fresh flowers anywhere near her in 3 years. She unpacked her 2 dresses, her books, her locked journal, and the letters she had not sent. A bundle of them now, tied with the bit of blue ribbon her mother had given her when she was 12, because she was a sentimental idiot who could not bring herself to throw away the physical evidence of the things she felt. She was placing the last of her books on the small shelf near the writing desk when she noticed the volume already there. It sat alone on the shelf, as though it had been placed rather than shelved. A first edition by the look of the binding, dark green, worn at the spine with the particular softness of a book that had been read many times. She picked it up, Thomas Gray. Elegy written in a country churchyard, bound with several of the odes. A first edition, 1751. She had mentioned this volume, precisely this volume, in a letter to her father 6 weeks ago. I have been rereading Gray's Elegy in the cheaper edition I managed to find at the Holborn bookseller. You know, the one on the corner, the one with the disagreeable cat in the window. And I keep thinking about the line, about the mute, inglorious Milton, the full paths of glory that lead but to the grave. There is something almost comforting in it, Father, the suggestion that one's obscurity is not failure, but simply a different kind of existence. She stood, holding the book for a long time. It was not a coincidence. It could not be a coincidence. One did not place a first edition of Gray's Elegy on the shelf of a guest room, coincidentally. Someone had known she would want it. Someone had known she had mentioned it in a specific letter to her father. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the book, and she thought very carefully about what this meant. She opened her journal, picked up her pen. The page received what she was not ready to say aloud. Evening, Friday the 21st October, Ashmore House. I have been here 6 hours, and I have already found one thing that does not fit the explanation I have been given for why I am here. A first edition of Gray has been placed on my shelf. I mentioned that volume in a letter to Father, a letter sent to Marshalsea, which is not a prison where letters are known for their reliable delivery. The Duke of Ashmore is watching me more carefully than he has admitted. I do not yet know whether this is dangerous. I know that it is something. He is not what I expected. I came here expecting to be able to place him easily in a category: ruthless creditor, cold financier, the human face of an inhuman system. And he does not sit still in that category. He looked at me today at dinner as though he were doing arithmetic, and had not yet arrived at the answer. There is something behind the iron of him that I cannot name. I do not trust this. I do not trust him. I do not trust myself for finding him interesting. Father, wherever you are tonight, I hope the food is warm. Chapter 6. Adrian, he had not intended to watch her reorganize the library. He had come to retrieve a document, a specific correspondence from 1808, that he required for the meeting with his solicitors the following morning. And she had been there at 7 o'clock in the evening with a candle on the shelf beside her, moving systematically through the collection with the expression of a person who has discovered a problem they are constitutionally obligated to solve. The cataloguing system, she said, without turning around, is organized by acquisition date. He stopped in the doorway. Yes. That is not a cataloguing system. That is a record of purchasing decisions arranged to look like a cataloguing system. None of these volumes can be found without knowing when they were bought, which means they cannot be found by anyone other than yourself, and barely then. I know where everything is, at present. When you are dead, Your Grace, no one will be able to locate anything, and several of these volumes are genuinely important. She turned then, and her expression was the same one he had seen at the auction house and in his study. That look of frank assessment that did not require his permission to proceed. I am going to reorganize it by subject, and then by author, unless you have an objection. He did not have an objection. He found his document. In the third position from the left, 1808, which even he had to count along to locate, and took it and left her to it. At dinner, a small gathering of 4 that he had arranged primarily to begin establishing her social presence in appropriate company, she sat across from Lady Beresford, a baroness of the species that had honed condescension to an art form over 60 years of practice. Lady Beresford had looked at Violet with the particular smile one deploys when one wishes to make a categorization evident without lowering oneself to stating it aloud. Miss Ashworth, she had said over the soup. I believe your father was the Viscount Ashworth? Yes. Such a shame. The shame carrying a weight of implication that was meant to conclude rather than open the subject. Violet had said, pleasantly, Indeed, though I find the word shame interesting, Lady Beresford, as its usage in society seems to distribute rather unevenly, landing most heavily on those who have the least culpability for the circumstances that invited it. I believe that is what Mr. Wordsworth would have called the tyranny of the ordinary, though perhaps you do not read Wordsworth. The table went very still. Then Lord Cartwright, the most senior gentleman present, laughed, a genuine, surprised sound, and the tension broke and the dinner continued. Adrian had said nothing. He had raised his wine-glass. Later, in his study, he took out the bundle of letters. He did not reread them. He had them, by this point, largely memorized. He sat with them in his hands and thought about the woman upstairs who corrected his secretary's Latin in passing. He had witnessed this on Wednesday. Alderton had taken it with remarkable good grace, and reorganized libraries on principle, and dismantled social weaponry with Wordsworth, and then went quietly to her room and wrote, he was certain. Everything that had actually been happening behind her composed exterior. He had read those letters. He had read all of them. He was beginning to understand, in a situation of extraordinary ethical complexity that he had constructed entirely by himself. He put the letters away. He picked up her most recent one. The one about the grey volume, the one that had arrived at the prison through the regular channels and been intercepted by the guard in his employ before it reached the Viscount. And he read it twice. She knew about the book. Of course she did. She was not a woman who missed things. He set it down. Then he did something he had not done in 15 years. He sat with the question of whether what he was doing was right, and he did not, this time, find the question comfortable. Chapter 7. Violet. The gown was green, and it was not hers, and it fitted her in a way that her own dresses never did, which was its own particular form of torment. Mrs. Prentice had produced it the morning of the Hargrove musicale, presenting it with the neutrally efficient expression of a woman fulfilling a task she had been given that she did not entirely understand. It was silk, empire waisted, the deep green of old bottle glass, with a narrow border of darker embroidery at the hem. It was beautiful, and it fitted across the bosom with a precision that Violet found simultaneously gratifying and deeply alarming. She stood before the glass in her room and felt the familiar calculation begin. The inventory of the ways in which her figure departed from the long, lean ideal that fashion plates recommended. Her waist was not narrow. Her hips were, she had been described once by a dressmaker with more honesty than tact, as well-formed, in the tone one uses when one means more than expected. The silk made no adjustments for any of this. It simply presented her as she was, with considerable clarity. She put on her spectacles, straightened her spine in the way Dante had. No, in the way she had decided to carry herself, and went downstairs. The Duke was waiting in the entrance hall. He had his back to the staircase, speaking to Alderton in a low voice, and turned at her footfall on the third step from the bottom. His hand, which had been gesturing to punctuate something he was saying, stopped mid-movement, completely, as though the thought driving it had simply discontinued. Alderton said something. Adrian did not appear to hear it. Violet reached the bottom of the stairs. "Good evening, Your Grace, Miss Ashworth." His voice was entirely composed. His face was entirely composed. His hand, she noticed, closed into a loose fist at his side before settling. "You look very well." It was not effusive. It was not the sort of compliment that would make her feel flattered and ridiculous. It was simply stated, as though it were the same order of information as the weather or the time, and somehow that made it the most affecting compliment anyone had paid her in 3 years. "The gown is very fine," she said. "It suits you." Alderton had apparently decided he was not part of this conversation, and removed himself quietly. They went to the carriage. The Hargrove Musicale was everything London society did when it wanted to perform the idea of culture without being obligated to actually experience. A room full of expensive people arranged around a pianoforte, conducting their social negotiations in the register of whispered commentary, while the music served as ambient backdrop. The musicians were, Violet noted, genuinely excellent. Almost no one was listening to them, which she found quietly tragic. She had been present for perhaps 20 minutes when a gentleman appeared at her elbow. Tall, fair, with the easy confidence of a man who has moved through rooms like this all his life and found them accommodating. "Mr. Richard Hargrove," he said, bowing. He was the host's younger brother, she gathered. She had been provided a brief intelligence report on the evening's attendees by Alderton before departure, which she was beginning to understand was a standard preparation in Ashmore's household. "I do not believe we have met. Miss Ashworth," she said. "Violet Ashworth." Something shifted in his expression, the name recognition, the calculation. To his credit, it lasted less than 2 seconds before he recovered a smile. "I believe you are staying as a guest of the Duke of Ashmore?" "In a professional capacity, yes." "And do you enjoy London, Miss Ashworth, or are you primarily a country person?" It was ordinary conversation. She managed it well. She always managed ordinary conversation well, having learned years ago that managing was the operative word, that social performance was a skill like any other and could be practiced to proficiency, regardless of one's interior state. Mr. Hargrove was attentive in a way that was slightly more attentive than the occasion required. He refilled her glass. He directed the conversation toward her opinions on the music, which she gave honestly. He smiled at her with the specific warmth of a man who had decided she was interesting and wished her to know it. She became aware, at some point, she could not have said exactly when, that he was no longer entirely attentive. Something had distracted him. He answered her question about Beethoven with half a sentence and then said, "Oh, I beg your pardon, Miss Ashworth. I believe Lord Cartwright requires, do excuse me," and was gone. Violet looked after him with mild puzzlement. Then she turned and found herself holding her glass and standing alone, which she had not been 3 minutes prior, and then realized that the woman who had been about to join their circle from the left had instead pivoted away, and the introduction that had been forming from the right had somehow not completed itself. The social geography around her had been quietly, completely rearranged. She turned further and saw Adrian 15 feet away, speaking with perfect pleasantness to Lord and Lady Cartwright, his gaze not on her at all, his body language entirely relaxed. But she was standing alone in a cleared circle, and Mr. Hargrove had been redirected, and the approaching introduction had evaporated, and she could not see the mechanism of any of it. She thought about it for quite some time. In the carriage home, he said, "You managed that very well." "Did I?" she said, and looked out the window. "I found myself rather more alone than I might have expected at points. Hargrove is not a suitable acquaintance for someone in your position." She turned. "I was not aware my acquaintances were being curated. They are not being curated. I simply—" "You cleared the circle, Your Grace." She said it without heat, because she had decided, in the 20 minutes since she noticed it, that fury was premature without understanding. "I would like to know why." He was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove has a reputation for pursuing unattached women who lack social protection. I thought it unwise, and if I had judged him harmless myself, then I would have been wrong, and you would tell me so." She considered this. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was, she noted, an honest one. He had not pretended she hadn't noticed, had not deflected, had not told her she had misread the situation. Next time, she said, "Tell me. Do not simply rearrange the furniture without informing me." "Noted," he said. She looked back out the window. The city moved past in amber and grey. She did not examine, in the carriage, why the matter-of-fact possessiveness of he thought it unwise settled in her, with something warmer than offence. She examined it later, in her journal, with more honesty than she found comfortable. Chapter 8. Adrian. The letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked inside the regular bundle of Marshalsea correspondence, written on cheap prison paper, in a hand that shook slightly. Whether from cold or age, or illness, he could not tell. In the compressed, careful script of a man who had been a gentleman and had not stopped being one. "My darling Violet, I must be brief as the guard grows impatient. I want to tell you something I should have told you years ago and did not, from what I believed was protection, but which I now understand was cowardice. The investment documents, the ones that precipitated the proceedings against me, were not accurate records of my decisions. I am not saying this to excuse myself in your eyes or to ask you to excuse me. I am saying it because it is true, and truth is the only inheritance I have left to leave you. Someone falsified those documents. I do not know who. I have suspected over these months, and I am beginning to approach a name, but I will not put it on paper until I am certain. I remain your father, whatever that means now. Do not grieve too hard for me. Grieve productively. Bring me evidence. With all my love." Father Adrian sat at his desk with this letter in his hands for a considerable time. It was not a dramatic revelation. It was a crack, hairline, and very precise in the edifice of certainty he had spent 15 years constructing. Falsified documents. He had built the case against Viscount Ashworth on records, on the investment instruments and the correspondence and the paper trail that showed Ashworth had taken his father's money with full knowledge of the fraudulent scheme. He had had those documents examined. He had had solicitors verify them. He had believed, meticulous. But he was a man who understood financial fraud, intimately and from the losing side. He knew, better than most, how convincing a falsified instrument could be. He knew how a deliberate, sophisticated forgery could survive initial examination. He set the letter down. He took out a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote one line: retrieve all original investment documents, 1798 through 1802. Full forensic examination. Discretion absolute. He sent it to his solicitor. He sent a second note to a different man entirely, a man he employed specifically for matters that could not go through ordinary channels, asking for a comprehensive review of every individual who had stood to benefit from the collapse of both the Ashworth estate and, 15 years earlier, the Blackwell family's financial position. He said nothing to Violet. He told himself this was because the investigation was preliminary. He told himself he would speak when he had evidence, rather than suspicion. He told himself discretion was the appropriate course. He sat with the letter in his hands and thought about a woman who wrote to her imprisoned, farther about Gray's Elegy and the mute, inglorious Milton. And he felt for the first time in 15 years the specific cold weight of a possibility he had not permitted himself to consider. What if he had been wrong? Not wrong to want justice for his father. Not wrong about the grief and the loss and the years of grinding poverty that had followed his father's death, but wrong about the instrument of it, wrong about who had actually held the pen. He put the letter with the others. He poured himself a whiskey. He did not drink it. He went to the window and stood looking at the October rain and thought about what it would mean to a man who had built the architecture of his life on a grievance, to discover that the grievance had been, at least in part, manufactured. Chapter 9. Violet. She found the ledger on a Tuesday afternoon, in the third hour of reorganizing the lower shelves of the library. It was not shelved with the books. It was tucked behind a set of bound legal volumes in the far corner, between Blackstone's commentaries and a set of parliamentary records from 1796. It was an unremarkable object. A standard accounting ledger, dark green cover, the kind used throughout the commercial world, except for the date on the spine, 1799 to 1801, and a notation in the lower right corner that read Ashmore, Cashworth Investment Correspondence. She stood holding it for a moment, then she opened it. The entries were what one would expect of a shared investment record. Figures, dates, signatories. The investment was what she understood her father had been accused of manipulating. A canal project in the north of England. Substantial capital from multiple investors. Projected returns that had, ultimately, not materialized. But what these records showed, what she could see, working her way through the columns, with the methodical reading of a woman who had grown up, managing household accounts during leaner and leaner years, was a significant amount of correspondence between the Ashmore estate and Ashworth, beginning in 1799 and continuing through 1801. The Blackwell family, Adrian's family, had been investors. Of course they had. That was common knowledge. It was the basis of the grievance that had driven the ruin of her father. But what the ledger showed, in entries that someone had been careful to obscure, but not careful enough to erase, was that a third party had been managing the investment documentation. Not Ashworth directly, not Blackwell. Someone operating between them, someone whose initials appeared repeatedly in the margin notations. CSM. She closed the ledger. She put it back exactly where she had found it, with the same layer of dust undisturbed around it as best she could manage. She went to dinner. He was already at the table when she sat down. He looked up briefly. The habitual assessment she had noticed that he performed on any person entering his presence, the rapid inventory of state and expression. She had become something of an expert at presenting him with a composed surface to inventory. "I finished the lower shelves of the library today," she said, taking her soup. "I see. Remarkable what one finds, reorganizing a library." She looked at her spoon. "I came across some accounting ledgers from the turn of the century. Investment records, by the look of them." She looked up. "Rather extensive correspondence with my father's estate. From what I could see, his expression did not change, not by a single degree. This was," she noted, "extraordinary. Most people, confronted with an unexpected mention of something they wished to keep quiet, produced some involuntary flicker, an eye movement, a stilled hand, a pause half a beat too long. He produced nothing. A number of investment projects required correspondence with multiple parties," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I noticed there was also a third party involved. Initials CM in the margin notations. I wondered if you recognized them." The pause this time was half a beat. She would have missed it if she had not been looking. "Investment correspondence from that period involved many parties," he said. "I would need to review the specific document." "Of course." She returned to her soup. "How is the lamb?" "Very good." They finished dinner without returning to the subject. She did not press. Pressing prematurely was the error of someone who did not understand that patience was a form of pressure in itself. That night, past midnight, she sat at her writing desk and wrote to her father. The candle burned very low before she finished. "Father, I found something in the library today. I am not yet certain what it means, but I begin to think I understand more of the shape of what happened to us than I did a week ago. There is a third hand in this. There has always been a third hand, and I believe the Duke does not know I have seen it, or does not know how much I have understood, or, and this is the possibility that frightens me most, knows everything and is concealing it for reasons I cannot yet determine. I trust my own thinking. I have always trusted it. What I do not trust is the way I am beginning to respond to him, which is with something that I can only call curiosity, but which I suspect is something more specific than curiosity and more dangerous. I am frightened, Father, not of him, of what I am beginning to feel toward him, and what it will mean when I discover the full truth of what he has done. Tell me what you know about CM." She sealed the letter. She held it for a moment, thinking about the prison guard, thinking about the grey volume on her shelf, thinking about the initials in the margin. She did not send it that night. She held it in her locked journal instead, because something told her, some specific instinct, quieter and more insistent than ordinary caution, that this particular letter should not travel through the usual channels. She was right about that. She was right in a way she would not fully understand until morning, when it was too late. We are now at the center of Violet's story, and if you have been with us this far, you already know this is not an ordinary tale. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment. And leave us a comment. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? We are reading every single one. Now, Chapter 10. Adrian has just received information that is about to change everything he thought he knew. Chapter 10. Adrian. He read her letter at 5:30 in the morning. She had not sent it. He knew she had not sent it, because it had not come through the postal system, but had been retrieved by other means, a detail he did not examine too closely in the grey pre-dawn of his study. He read it once, quickly. He read it again, slowly. The way I am beginning to respond to him, which is with something that I can only call curiosity, but which I suspect is something more specific than curiosity and more dangerous. He set it down. She was close to the truth. She had the initials. She had seen the ledger. She had the intelligence and the persistence and the specific quality of mind that did not stop working a problem until the problem yielded, and the problem was going to yield soon. She would piece it together. She was already piecing it together, and when she did, she would piece it together without him, which meant she would have only the evidence, and not the context, only the shape of the harm, and not the wound behind it. He owed her the full truth. He had owed it to her for some time. He had been telling himself he was waiting for certainty, waiting for the investigation to complete, waiting for a better moment. These were, he understood now in the clear, brutal light of pre-dawn, the justifications of a man who was afraid. He was afraid. This was a new and thoroughly unwelcome experience. He went upstairs. He knocked on the door of her sitting room at 6 o'clock in the morning, which was not a thing that was done in any household that observed the conventions of propriety, which meant that by knocking, he was already telling her that what he had come to say could not wait for propriety. There was a silence. Then, "Who is there?" "Ashmore." Another silence. "It is 6 o'clock in the morning, Your Grace." "I know. I apologize for the hour. I need to speak with you." The sound of movement. The door opened. She was wearing a dressing gown of practical grey wool over her nightdress, her hair in a loose braid over one shoulder, her spectacles not yet on. She held them in her hand, which made her look simultaneously younger and more exposed, and he felt the wrongness of having come here at this hour with a sharp internal jolt. "Come in," she said, and her voice was the voice he had been reading for 2 months. Steady and watchful and aware, she put her spectacles on and sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. He stood, because sitting would have suggested a conversation of comfort rather than one of honesty. "You found the ledger," he said. "Yes, and you have been in correspondence with your father through unofficial channels, I suspect, given the timing of the last letter." He watched her face. "You asked him about CM. Her expression was very careful and very still. "How do you know what?" I asked my father. He did not look away from her. "Because the letters going to and from Marshalsea have been passing through my employ for 2 months. The guard in charge of that wing is in my employment." The room was absolutely silent. "I see," she said. Her voice was the same, only her hands, which she had folded in her lap, were not quite still. "I need to tell you why I destroyed your father," he said. "All of it. I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it without the version of it you will construct from fragments, because the fragments will not be enough, and you deserve the whole of it." "Then tell me," she said. Quiet. Quiet was, he had come to understand, where her real fury lived. He told her all of it. His father, a gentleman, a trusting man, a man who had loved his son and his garden, and had been the whole of what of Adrian had understood the word home to mean. The investment scheme of 1799, the documents he had signed. The money that had gone, all of it, into what he had believed was a sound venture, and what had in fact been a fraudulent extraction. The poverty that followed, not the romantic poverty of reduced circumstances, but the real kind, the kind where you cannot heat 2 rooms in winter, where the doctor cannot be afforded, where you watch a person's dignity erode because the world that had valued them has been taken away. His father's death, the grave in Derbyshire, the promise he had made. "I spent 15 years, he said, and his voice was steady because he had learned to hold things very tightly a very long time ago, building enough power and position to do what I did. to ruin him as he ruined my father. I did not arrive at it impulsively. I was methodical. I was thorough. I believed I had verified everything. I believed your father had done deliberately and knowingly to mine what I subsequently did to him. She said nothing. She was looking at the cold fireplace, not at him. I was not careless, he said. I was not cruel in the sense of enjoying cruelty. I believed I was delivering a just consequence. I understand now that that is not a defense. A just consequence delivered to the wrong person is not justice. No, she said, very quietly, it is not. I began to have doubts when I read your letters. He paused. The letters you wrote to your father in Marshalsea, I read them. I read all of them. And they were not the letters of a woman who had grown up complicit in comfortable fraud. They were the letters of a woman who had been reduced to nothing through no action of her own, and had decided every single day to remain upright. He stopped. Then I did that to you. Not all of it, but enough of it that I cannot stand in this room without carrying that weight. She turned and looked at him. He had expected fury. He had prepared for fury. He had spent the walk up the stairs, steeling himself against the cold-controlled rage that she carried and could deploy. He had learned, with the precision of someone who had mastered their own weapon. What he had not prepared for was the look on her face, which was not rage, but something older and more terrible. The expression of a person looking at something true that costs them. You did it, she said, for your father. Yes, and my father has been in prison for 11 months. For something that may not have been. She stopped. Her jaw worked briefly. She gathered herself. You said you were having doubts. Why? A letter from your father, intercepted 2 weeks ago. He says the documents were falsified. She closed her eyes for one breath. Does he say by whom? Not in writing. He says he suspects, but he will not put it in writing until he is certain. He paused. I have my own investigation running. I am beginning to see a name. CM, she said. Yes. He looked at her directly. Miss Ashworth. Violet, I cannot undo what I have done. I understand that. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you the truth because you were about to find it yourself, and you deserve to hear it from me rather than from a ledger. She was quiet for a long time. The grey morning light was coming through the curtains now, making the room gentler than it deserved to be. Get out, she said, still quiet, still that same compressed exact voice. Please leave my room, Your Grace. Yes, he said. He moved toward the door, stopped. The investigation will continue. Whatever it finds, your father will be freed if there is evidence to free him. That is a promise with no conditions attached. She did not respond. He left. He pulled the door closed behind him with great care, the way one closes a door on something that must not be disturbed, and stood in the hallway of his own house in the grey morning, and felt the specific cold of a man who has done the necessary thing and found it inadequate. Chapter 11. Violet, 3 days. She performed every social obligation of those 3 days with such complete and flawless precision that Mrs. Prentice, who had managed this house for 14 years, and was not a woman easily impressed, remarked to the cook that she had never seen a young woman hold herself so well. What Mrs. Prentice was observing, and what she could not have known, was not composure. It was the expression a person has when they have taken something enormous and placed it in a room inside themselves and shut the door and are standing in front of that door to make sure nothing escapes. Violet hosted a small luncheon. She attended a gallery viewing with the Cartwright ladies. She managed a particularly tedious evening at the Bellingham card party, with such grace that Lady Bellingham told 3 separate people afterward that Ashmore's guest was quite remarkable for someone in her situation. She did not speak to Adrian beyond what the social requirements of shared meals demanded. She was perfectly polite. She was frigidly warm. She was so entirely composed that everyone in the household could feel the temperature of the rooms she was not in. Aldous, the Duke's elderly valet, who had been with the Blackwell family since before Adrian was born, and who had, over 4 decades of service, developed a relationship with truth that bypassed the usual professional discretions, found Adrian in his study on the second evening and said, with the gentle, devastating honesty of very old retainers, "I have been in service 40 years, Your Grace, and I have never seen you look the way you look when she is not in the room." Adrian said nothing. Aldous said nothing further. He collected the empty decanter and left. On Thursday, Violet visited Marshalsea. The prison smelled, as it always did, of damp stone and unwashed wool, and the particular staleness of enclosed bodies, a smell she had learned not to flinch from, because flinching wasted energy she needed. She was shown to the visiting room, a grey space with a table that had been marked by years of elbows, and she sat and waited. Her father came in and she stood, and what she saw in his face, the way it changed when it saw hers, the relief and the grief and the love all arriving at once, the way weather arrives, complete and overwhelming, made her throat close. He was thinner than last month. He was always thinner than last month. He was 61 years old, and he had a cough that had not been mentioned in his letters but was present now, a dry, persistent thing that he covered with his hand when it came. "You have news," he said, sitting. It was not a question. "I have very much news," she said. She told him what she had found, the ledger, the initials. She told him about Adrian's confession. She used his title, said the Duke, and saw something move through her father's face that was complex and not entirely resolved. She told him about the investigation. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew it was serious. Her father, in health and in his full self, had been a wonderfully interruptive man. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lord Cavendish Mar." She looked at him. "That is the name," he said. "That is who I have been working toward for 11 months, Lord Cavendish Mar. He is, or was, I do not know if he is still active, a political fixer. He operated between the great families and the financial institutions for 30 years. He arranged investments, managed introductions, facilitated certain outcomes." His jaw tightened. He arranged the investment in the canal project of 1799. He provided the documentation to both Blackwell and to me. I believe those documents to be genuine accounts. I now believe, based on what I have pieced together from what I could access here, that he falsified them on both sides. Violet said very carefully, "Both sides. Both sides." He created a fraud that looked, from every angle, as though it originated with me. He used Blackwell's genuine grievance. Yes, his father did lose money. Yes, I was associated with the investment. And he magnified it, fabricated the evidence of deliberate intent, and let Blackwell's anger do the rest. He leaned forward. "I was not innocent in all things, Violet. I made poor decisions in that period. I trusted men I should have verified, but I did not defraud the Blackwell family. I did not know their money was at risk. That was Mare." She sat with this. "Mare," she said, "why? What did he stand to gain?" Her father's expression was tired and old and very clear. He stood to gain a canal project worth a great deal of money, cleared of 2 families who might otherwise have investigated it closely. With us both destroyed, Blackwell's father dead, Blackwell himself reduced, and then consumed with revenge, my family ruined. No one was left who had reason to look carefully at what had become of the original investment. Violet thought about Adrian in the auction house, buying her father's last cottage in 2 raised fingers and 3 words. She thought about him reading her letters. She thought about the grey volume on her shelf. She stood, kissed her father's forehead, told him she would return in 1 week, and walked out of Marshalsea into the grey London afternoon, with the name Lord Cavendish Mare in her mind like a key that had just found the right lock. Chapter 12. Adrian. The name came to him from 2 directions in the same week, which was not coincidence. Coincidence was a word used by people who had not examined the evidence carefully. His own investigation, the forensic examination of the 1798 to 1802 investment documents, which his solicitor had been conducting with the thoroughness that Adrian's instructions required and his payment supported, arrived at the same conclusion in a document delivered on a grey Friday morning. The investment instruments were forgeries. Sophisticated, excellent, verifiable-looking forgeries, produced by a hand that knew both parties' authentic documentation well enough to replicate it convincingly. The margins on the original Ashmore correspondence, cross-referenced against known authentic letters from that period, showed a deviation in the ink composition consistent with reproduction. The documents had been manufactured. Lord Cavendish Mar, 70 years old, 3rd son of a baronet. Career in political facilitation spanning 3 decades. Connected to the Home Office, to several of the great banking families, to at least 2 government ministers currently in post. A man so thoroughly embedded in the infrastructure of power that his name appeared nowhere prominently and everywhere functionally. Adrian sat at his desk with both sets of documents in front of him, the forensic report and the intelligence summary on Mare, and he thought about his father. His father had trusted a man who had taken his money on the basis of manufactured evidence and left him with nothing. His father had died from the knowledge of having been deceived by someone he thought he knew, and Adrian had spent 15 years doing precisely what Mare had done, constructing a narrative, gathering instruments, and deploying them against a man whose real guilt he had never properly verified. He had been Mar's instrument. Without knowing it, without consenting to it, he had picked up the weapon that Mar had forged and used it on the wrong man, and called it justice, and now a 60-year-old Viscount had spent 11 months in Marshalsea prison for a fraud he did not commit. He sat with this for a long time, not with the productive urgency of a man planning his next action, but with the still, clear weight of a man understanding something about himself that could not be ununderstood. Then his solicitor's second note arrived. It had been placed at the bottom of the delivery folder, separated from the forensic report, and it contained a single additional document, a genealogical record, recently cross-referenced against the Thornwall family archive at his request, because he had come across a piece of information in the letters. A passing reference to Violet's maternal grandmother, the woman she had called Grandmother Eleanor, with a specificity and a tenderness that had for some reason he had not examined, lodged in his memory. He read the genealogical document once. He read it again. He set it down on his desk very carefully, the way one sets down a thing that one is not entirely sure is real. Violet Ashworth was not, or not only, the daughter of a disgraced Viscount. Through her mother's line, through the woman she had called Grandmother Eleanor, she was the legitimate biological granddaughter of Eleanor, Duchess of Thornwall, the highest-ranking woman in England by title and by age, and by the accumulated authority of 80 years of absolute social dominance. Which meant that Violet, who had been standing in the back of Carrington's auction house in a let-out grid dress with 2 shillings and a satchel, outranked him. Had always outranked him. Had outranked him at the auction, at the dinner, at the library, and in the sitting room 3 mornings ago, when he had come to confess his sins to a woman who was, by blood, his social superior. He laughed. It was a brief, genuine, completely involuntary sound. Then he stood up. He went to find Violet, chapter 13. Violet. She was in the library. Of course she was. She had returned to the reorganization project. It was nearly complete, which she found gave her a satisfaction that she recognized. Was partly the satisfaction of having improved something, and partly the satisfaction of doing something with her hands when her mind needed occupation. She was on the second shelf from the top of the east wall when she heard him come in. She did not turn around. She finished the placement of the volume in her hand. Johnson's Dictionary, 1755, first edition, which she had found on the wrong shelf and put right. And then she turned. He was holding 2 documents. His face had the expression she had come to recognize as his most honest face, which was not the cold composure of public Ashmore or the watchful calculation of private negotiations, but something simpler and more costly. The expression of a man who has given up on managing how he appears. "I have found 2 things," he said. "I need to tell you both of them." She came down from the step stool. She stood and looked at him with the steady attention she gave to things that mattered. "Then tell me, the documents from the 1799 investment, the ones on which the case against your father is built, are forgeries." He extended the forensic report. She took it, looked at it quickly, and with comprehension. "My solicitor is in no doubt. They were manufactured by a sophisticated hand to implicate your father in a fraud he did not commit. The original investment funds were not managed by your father, but by a third party operating between both families." "Lord Cavendish Mar," she said. He went still. "Your father told you, when I visited yesterday." She looked at the report. "He had been working toward the name for 11 months. You arrived at it from the other direction." She folded the document with the care of someone who understands the value of what they are holding. "This frees him." "Yes. I will have the proceedings stayed by Monday, and the charges vacated as soon as the evidence can be formally submitted. I have already sent a preliminary communication to the relevant officers." He paused. "I will stand as the party presenting the exculpatory evidence. There is no way to manage this that does not make public what I did. That I called in the debts, that I initiated the proceedings, that I acted on what I believed was just cause and was not. I understand that there will be consequences to my reputation. I am not asking you to manage any part of that for me." She looked at him for a moment. "You said there were 2 things." He held out the second document. She took it. She read it. The library was very quiet. Outside she could hear the street. A cart, a child's voice, the ordinary sounds of London proceeding with its magnificent indifference. Inside, the only sound was the paper in her hands. She read it twice. She put it down on the shelf beside her carefully, and she looked at the wall for a moment, and then at the floor, and then, because there was nothing for it, back at him. "She knew," Violet said. "The Duchess knew, and she never—" She stopped. Her voice had done something it was not given to doing in company. She took a breath. "My father hid this. To protect her," Adrian said. "There was a scandal, 30 years ago, involving the Duchess's youngest daughter, your mother. The Duchess's family concealed the marriage to prevent the story from becoming public. Your father agreed, as the price of the marriage, to keep the connection quiet. The price of the marriage." The bitterness in her voice was not directed at him. The price of being permitted to love someone. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "What does this mean?" she asked. not about the social mathematics of it. She was already working those out. She could feel the calculation running. She meant something else. "It means you are not who you were told you were," he said. "Not only, and not completely. It means the story of your family is more complicated than the version you were given. It means," he looked at her directly, "that you deserve the truth even when it costs me everything." She heard that. She heard the specificity of "costs me everything." What it had admitted, what it revealed about the 15 years of architecture he had built around a wound, and what it would mean for that architecture to be dismantled. She did not let herself feel what she was beginning to feel. Not yet. Not in this room with him standing there, holding the pieces of her rearranged life. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "The lineage. You could have managed it differently. You could have approached the Duchess separately. You did not have to put that document in my hands first." "No," he said, "I did not. Then why?" He looked at her. His face, in the morning light of the library she had reorganized, was not the face of a duke or a financier, or a man who bought cottage at auction with 2 raised fingers. It was the face she had been reading, without knowing she was reading it, since the day she walked into his study in her best blue wool dress and told him she did not forgive him. "Because it is yours," he said. "Because everything in your life that should have been yours has been taken from you by the decisions of people around you who decided they knew better, and I will not be another one of those people." She turned away from him. She put her hands on the shelf and looked at the reorganized books and breathed. "Go," she said. "Please, not because I am angry, because I need to be alone with this." He went. She stood in the library for a long time after his footsteps faded, and she felt something happen in the architecture of what she had decided to feel about Adrian Blackwell, 5th Duke of Ashmore, some weight-bearing wall shifting, not collapsing but moving. She did not call it anything yet. She was not ready, but it moved. Chapter 14. Adrian. She came to his study the next morning with the ledger under her arm and the forensic report in her satchel, and her spectacles straight, and her expression set in the manner of a woman who has made a decision. "I am coming with you to see Ma," she said. He looked at her. "I had not yet said I was going to see Ma." "You were going to," she said. "You have the evidence, you have the name, and you are a man who, once in possession of sufficient information, acts. You are going to confront him. I am coming." He considered this for the approximately 4 seconds it took to recognize that refusing her was both practically futile and, as a matter of justice, not his right. "You understand it may not be civilized. I am the daughter of a man who spent 11 months in Marshalsea prison for a crime he did not commit," she said. "I have redefined my concept of civilized." They went the following morning to Lord Mar's townhouse in Berkeley Square. A handsome house, well maintained, the residence of a man who had spent 30 years benefiting from other people's misfortunes, without the misfortune of being visibly connected to any of them. Ma received them in his drawing room. He was 70 years old, thick-set, with the slow, careful movements of a very old spider, not from weakness, but from the habit of conserving energy for when it was needed. He looked at Adrian with the wariness of a man who has long since calculated all visible threats. He looked at Violet with the mild condescension of a man who does not consider women threats at all. He was going to discover that this was a miscalculation. "Miss Ashworth," Ma said after Violet had been introduced, "I knew your father slightly. A great shame, his situation." "It is," Violet said pleasantly, "particularly given that it resulted from forgery." She opened her satchel. "I wonder if you recognize the hand in these documents." She placed the forensic report and 3 reproduced pages from the ledger on the side table, with the composure of someone who has set up this particular arrangement many times in her imagination. Ma looked at the documents. A very small thing happened to his hands, which he covered by clasping them. "These are old investment records," he said. "Yes, from 1799, regarding the Northern Canal project, in which both the Ashmore and Ashworth families were investors." She took out the letter from her father, the one she had not sent, the one that had never gone through the regular channels. "This is my father's account of the investment, written in Marshalsea, in which he identifies the party who managed the documentation for both families. He names you Lord Mar." "Your father is a convicted fraudster," Mar said, and there was something in his voice now. Not panic, not yet, but the quickening of a man realizing he needs to change the game. "His account is hardly. The forensic examination of the original instruments," Violet continued, as though he had not spoken, "identifies the paper composition, ink formulation, and pen-stroke deviation from authentic correspondence. The paper used in the falsified documents is a specific grade imported from Flanders, available from one supplier in London between 1797 and 1803. That supplier's records. She produced one final document, which she had obtained through a particular bookseller who had a particular friendship with a particular records clerk at the Board of Trade, and which had taken her most of the previous evening. Show their principal client in that period to have been your household account." The room was absolutely quiet. Adrian, who had said nothing since they arrived, and who had been watching, leaned forward and said one sentence. "The evidence will go to the Home Office this afternoon, Lord Mar, with or without your response to it. The question before you is whether you choose to cooperate with the subsequent inquiry or to be entirely at its mercy." Ma looked between them. He was old, and he was powerful, and he had spent 30 years being impossible to catch, and she could see in his face the moment when he understood that the net had been drawn in so completely that thrashing would only tighten it. He did not confess. Men like Ma did not confess, not in the open, not to a woman and a duke in a drawing room, but he did not deny, and he did not, in the 40 minutes that followed, produce a single convincing alternative explanation for any of the evidence on the table. When they left, walking down the steps of Berkeley Square into the cool afternoon, Adrian said, "The Flanders paper supplier's records. How did you get those?" I asked. Violet said. He looked at her. "I have found," she said, "that a great many people will provide information when asked, with sufficient directness and a specific enough question. People are accustomed to being asked vague things and making vague responses. A precise question is disconcerting. It implies that the asker already knows something." She paused. "It is a method I developed shelving books. Librarians ask specific questions." He laughed. It was the same brief, genuine, involuntary sound she had heard from him only once before, in his study when he thought she was not close enough to hear. It changed his face entirely, erased 10 years of careful cold, and she had to look away from it because she was not yet ready for what it did to her. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. She adjusted her spectacles. "He destroyed my family," she said simply. "I have had 11 months to prepare." Chapter 15. Violet. Her father walked out of Marshalsea prison on a Wednesday morning at 9:10, when the light was thin and pale, and the air smelled of coal smoke and faintly of the river. She was waiting at the gate. She had been there since 8 o'clock. She had not been able to sleep past 4. She had sat in her room at Ashmore House and watched the darkness thin into morning and thought about her father's hands. The way they looked when he was reading, the way they moved when he was thinking through a problem, the way she had watched them grow thinner and more uncertain each weekly visit. The gate opened. He came out. He was smaller than she remembered, not in stature. He was still tall, still straight-backed in the way that years of a certain kind of breeding made structural, but in some quality of presence that prison had taken, and that would, she hoped, return. He blinked in the light. He looked at London with the slightly dazed expression of a person relearning a language. Then he saw her. She went to him. She did not run. Her feet moved too fast to quite be walking, but she did not run. She reached him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and the smell of him. Wool and soap, and something underneath that was just her father, just the specific human presence she had been missing, arrived in her lungs, and she felt something in her chest, let go, that she had been holding, clenched for 11 months. She did not cry immediately. She held on, and he held on, and they stood outside the gate of Marshalsea Prison, while London moved past them indifferently. Adrian stood 20 feet away. He had provided the carriage. He had not come forward. Her father lifted his head from hers and looked at him. "Lord Ashworth," Adrian said. He had walked forward when he saw her father look up. Not intrusively, but present. His voice was entirely even. "I am Adrian Blackwell. I owe you an apology that no words will adequately convey, and I intend to spend whatever time is required, ensuring that the material damage of what I did is entirely remedied. But first I want to ask you one direct question." Her father looked at him for a long moment. His eyes, which were still sharp, still the eyes that had taught her to read between lines, moved over Adrian's face with the attention of a man making an assessment. "Ask it," he said. "Do you intend to make this right by your daughter?" Adrian said. "Or merely by your conscience?" Her father's eyes moved to Violet. She saw something work through his expression. The love, the grief, the 11 months of absence, the specific look of a father recognizing that his daughter has become, in his absence, someone he needs to fully see. "She told you that I would ask you that question," her father said. It was not quite a smile. It was something more complex. "She did not need to," Adrian said. It was obvious. Her father looked at him. The silence had the quality of a weighing. "You read her letters," her father said. "Yes. And you are still here?" "Yes." Her father gave a single, slow nod. Not approval, exactly, and not absolution. Those were things that would take time, and perhaps could not be entirely given. But it was an acknowledgement of something, an indication that the conversation might be continued. Violet, watching this exchange, felt the tears arrive. Not from sadness. She had cried from sadness many times in the past 3 years, and had become fluent in that particular language. This was different. This was the tears of accumulated relief, of 11 months of held breath released, of the specific, unbearable weight of being loved and being seen, and not having to hold everything alone anymore. She did not make a sound. The tears simply came, and she let them, standing in the pale October light outside Marshalsea Prison. Adrian did not move toward her. He stood close enough that she could have leaned on him. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, and he was very still and very present, and he did not touch her. She did not lean, not yet. But she knew he was there. If this story has cost you any sleep, if you have paused it to breathe, share it with one person tonight. Not many, just one person who needs a story that does not waste their time. And if you have not liked this video yet, please do it now. It tells the world this story deserves to be heard. Chapter 16, Adrian, and what he decides next will cost him everything he spent 15 years building. Chapter 16. Adrian, the Duchess of Thornwall, arrived in London on the last Friday of October, in a carriage that was older than most of the buildings it passed, and that moved with the serene unhurriedness of something that has never needed to prove its importance by moving quickly. Her card arrived at Ashmore House at 11 o'clock Thursday evening, presented by a footman who had the expression of a man who has just delivered something slightly nuclear and wishes to be at a safe distance. The Duchess requested the company of Miss Violet Ashworth for 1 hour the following afternoon. It was phrased as a request. It was not. Adrian knew who the Duchess was. Everyone in England knew who the Duchess was. Eleanor, Duchess of Cornwall, was 80 years old, had outlived 3 monarchs and 2 prime ministers who had privately antagonized her, and was rumoured to have told the Prince Regent to his face, on one recorded occasion, that his waistcoats were an offence to the nation. No one had disputed this. He told Violet that morning at breakfast. She went very still over her toast. Then she said, "She wants to see me, yes. She knew about me. She has known all this time." A pause. She chose this moment. The timing of the Mar exposure, the restoration of your father's reputation, gave her a clean stage, he said. Before this week, acknowledging you would have meant entering a scandal. Now, acknowledging you is the opposite of that. Violet set down her toast. She looked at her hands. She waited until it was advantageous, she said. For 80 years, she is the most powerful woman in England, and she waited until there was no cost before she claimed her granddaughter. He had no defense to offer for the Duchess, who had made her own decisions for her own reasons. She may have reasons, he said carefully. She may, Violet said. I intend to ask her what they are. The Duchess's house was Cornwall House in Grosvenor Square, a building that had been absorbing the grandeur of centuries with the complete equanimity of a structure that knows it has outlasted everything that has tried to diminish it. Violet went in at 2:30. Adrian sat in his carriage outside and waited. He was, he acknowledged, doing something very close to pacing, in the contained way of a person who is seated. He thought about the Duchess, who had a granddaughter, who organized libraries on principle, and corrected Latin in passing, and sewed up knife wounds with steady hands, and who had looked at all of this from a comfortable distance for 24 years and done nothing. He thought about Violet, walking into that room with her spine straight and her spectacles level, and the particular quality of contained fire that was her most essential characteristic. He thought about how much he wished in this moment, and in many moments recently, that he had made different choices 15 years ago. Not even for the practical consequences of those choices, but because the person they had hurt had deserved better. The door opened at 3:30. Violet came out. She walked down the steps of Cornwall House and across the pavement and got into the carriage, and her expression was, stunned was not quite the word, reconstructed. As though something that had been arranged in one configuration had been entirely taken apart and put back differently, and she had not yet determined whether the new arrangement was better or worse, only that it was irrevocably different. He waited. She said, She is extraordinary. What did she say to you? Many things. Violet looked out the window, she explained herself. Whether her explanation is sufficient, I am not yet ready to decide. But she was honest, which is more than I expected. A pause. She said she has been watching from a distance for years. She said she arranged certain things. The governess position that came to me, which I had attributed to good fortune, the charitable recommendation that helped me find my rooms before I came here. She said. Those were her doing. He had not known that. He felt something that was not quite surprise, but was in the region of it. She said she chose this moment, because she wanted me to arrive on my own terms, Violet said. She said she did not want her granddaughter presented to society as a dependent of any great family, including hers. She wanted me to have established myself independently before she laid claim to the connection. Is that, he chose his word carefully, satisfying? Violet considered this with the honesty she applied to everything. It is more comprehensible than I expected. Whether I believe it entirely is a different question. She turned from the window and looked at him. She said something about you. He waited. She came back out onto the steps after I had said goodbye, and she looked at you, at the carriage, and she said. Violet paused, and something almost amused crossed her face. She said, "He is more than he has been, but she is more than he knows." And then she went back inside. He sat with this. He is more than he has been. 7 words from a woman who had judged prime ministers. What does she mean, he said, by more than he knows? Violet's expression was the one she had when she was reading something, and had arrived at the interesting part. I suspect, she said carefully, that you will have to determine that for yourself. Chapter 17. Violet. She went to his study at 11:30. The house was quiet in the way old houses get quiet late at night. Not empty, but resting, all its human activity concluded, its staff retired, its corridors settling. She had lain awake for 2 hours before she gave up the pretense of attempting sleep and put on her dressing gown and came downstairs. She had not intended to go to his study. She had intended to go to the library and find something to read until her mind quieted. But the light was on under the study door, and she stopped, and then she knocked. "Come in." He was at his desk, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Papers in front of him, the lamp making a circle of gold in the dark room. He looked up, and his expression completed the same involuntary rearrangement she had been studying and refusing to name since approximately Chapter 7 of the library reorganization. "Miss Ashworth, it is late." "Yes." She sat in the chair, her habitual chair, the one she had come to think of as hers, without examining the possessive. "I couldn't sleep, nor could I." He set down his pen. She looked at the papers on his desk. The Marr evidence, the formal submission to the Home Office. "I am thorough when it matters." A pause. "Your father's restoration should be complete by the end of next week. The legal notices will run in the Gazette. His title and remaining assets, what can be returned, will be confirmed." "The cottage," she said. He met her gaze. "I have already transferred it back. It was done this morning." She had not known that. She felt the specific catch in her throat of something unexpected and kind. "Thank you," she said. "It was not mine to keep." They sat in silence for a moment. "I am frightened," she said. She had not planned to say that. It came out simply, the way things come out at nearly midnight when one's defenses are tired. "Not of the Duchess, or of society, or of next week. I know how to manage those things. I have been managing impossible things for 3 years." "Then what?" She looked at the lamp. "I have been invisible by necessity for 3 years. Invisible is safe in its way. The strategy works. You cannot be struck if no one can see you, and now there are forces all at once, conspiring to make me visible, and I do not know who I will be when I am seen, whether I will still be myself, or whether being seen will change me into something I do not recognize." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been seeing you since before I met you." She looked at him. "The letters," he said. "I need to tell you the full truth of it." His voice was even, but she had learned to hear what was under the evenness. "I read them for 2 months before the auction. I arranged the Clarges Street rooms because I read your letters, and I could not. I was not able to complete my original plan and leave you homeless. I put the grey volume on your shelf because you had mentioned it, and I could not resist giving you a thing you wanted." He paused. "I attended the auction because of the letters. I had been planning to conduct the final proceedings through solicitors. I changed that plan because I needed to see the woman who wrote them." She held his gaze. "You fell in love with my letters." The word love sat in the room between them, new and enormous. "Yes," he said. With no qualification, she breathed. She processed this. She gave it the full, careful attention it deserved, which was the full, careful attention she gave to every important thing, which was perhaps more than he had expected. Then she said, "I am furious about the letters." "Yes," he said, "you have every right to be. I wrote those letters in grief. I wrote them in the most unguarded moments of 3 years of unguarded moments. I wrote them to my father, not to you. They were not meant to be seen." Her voice had a heat in it that was real, and he did not flinch from it. "I feel exposed in a way I did not consent to." "Yes," he said for the 3rd time. "And you read them, and you fell," you said. "And then you went to the auction house, and you bought the last thing my family had left. You bought me, in every practical sense of the word." "Yes, and you are asking me to find some way to." She stopped. Her hands were very still in her lap. "What are you asking me?" He came around from behind the desk. Not quickly. Nothing he did was quick. Everything was considered, but he came around and sat in the chair beside hers, not behind the desk, not across the room, and he looked at her with the face she had decided was his most honest face. "I am asking you nothing," he said. "I am telling you the truth because it is yours. I am telling you that I have read your letters, and I know your grief and your fury, and the way you write about the mute, inglorious Milton, and I find you extraordinary, every part of you. I am telling you that I am not a good man in the simple sense of the word, and I have done a thing that cost you an enormous amount, and I cannot undo it. I can only continue to be honest with you and continue to try to make it right." And he stopped, gathered himself. "I am telling you these things and not asking for anything. Whatever you do with it is yours." She looked at him for a long time. The fury was real. She was going to be angry about the letters for a while. Not forever, but for a while. And she was going to tell him so, more than once, and she was going to require that he understand it fully. That was not going to be bypassed or resolved in a single conversation, but underneath the fury. She was honest enough, in this midnight room, to look at what was underneath the fury. He had read the truest things she had ever written. He had read her grief, and her love, and her midnight fears, and her passionate quarrels with Milton, and he had fallen in love with it before he ever saw her face. He had arranged a warm room for her. He had put a book on her shelf. He had stood close enough to lean on at Marshalsea, and not touched her until she asked. She had not asked yet. "You read my letters," she said. "Yes, then you already know." She stopped. "I know," he said quietly. The room was very still. "I am going to be angry with you about it," she said. "For quite some time, I expect so, and I am going to require." She looked at him, and she felt the wall inside her. Not the one between them, but the one around herself, the one she had been building for 3 years out of necessity and composure, and the grey elegy, and the certainty that, being invisible was safer. She felt it shift, not fall, move. "I am going to require honesty, always. Everything, even when it is costly. You have had that," he said. "You will have it." "Then," she said, and she was aware this was a form of bravery she had not performed before, the specific kind that has no armor and no spectacles and no composed exterior, just the thing itself. "Then ask me." He looked at her. "Ask me," she said, "or I will be required to ask you." and I believe the convention of the era has some preference about which of us does the asking. His mouth, which she had been studying for weeks without admitting why, curved. Very slightly. Violet. Yes, may I kiss you? Yes, she said, you may. He leaned forward and kissed her, and it was not a performance, and it was not a conquest, and it was not the kind of kiss that erases everything that came before it. It was the kind of kiss that acknowledges everything before it and says, given all of that, given the full weight of all of that, still. She kissed him back. She was not timid about it. She had never, in the privacy of her own mind, been timid about anything. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers. I am still angry about the letters, she said. I know, he said. His voice was rough. Good. She went back upstairs. She lay in bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific impossible sensation of a life that might, after all, be moving towards something. Chapter 18. Violet. The Duchess of Thornwall presented her granddaughter to society on the first Saturday of November 1814 in the drawing-room of Thornwall House in Grosvenor Square. Before an audience of approximately 30 people whose combined social influence could reshape the landscape of London society within a single season. It was not a ballroom spectacle. It was not a triumph in the theatrical sense. No fanfare, no grand staircase entrance, no practiced fainting or tears of overwhelmed humility. Violet was not that kind of woman, and the Duchess, who had known her granddaughter for exactly 1 week and had apparently formed views about her, with considerable speed, had arranged the occasion to match the person. It was instead a presentation of fact. The Duchess sat in her chair, the specific chair positioned in the center of the room that had held her for 40 years of such occasions, and received her guests with the serene certainty of a woman who has never in her life required anyone else's permission for anything. She introduced Violet to each person individually with the same tone one uses when introducing a fact that has always been true and is simply now being acknowledged. Violet stood straight and wore the emerald silk gown she had been given for the musicale, and kept her spectacles level, and shook hands and answered questions with the honest composure that she had spent 3 years learning to deploy not as armor but as self. She was nervous. She was not, as she had feared she might be, undone by the nervousness. The room received her well. The Thornwall connection was too powerful to be socially quarrelled with by anyone present, and the story of the Mar fraud, which had been moving through London in the accelerated way that compelling true stories move, had already done a mix-bine, considerable amount of preparatory work. Miss Violet Ashworth was not the disgraced daughter of a fraudster. She was the granddaughter of the most powerful woman in England, who had been the collateral victim of a deliberate fraud, who had survived it with her character entirely intact, and who had been instrumental in its exposure. That was a story that society understood how to accommodate. It also helped, one heard several people remark, that she was very well formed and wore that green dress admirably. Adrian stood near the window. He was not presented alongside her. This was her occasion, not his, and they had both understood that without it needing to be said. But he was present in the room, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, in the specific manner of people who have become the background, atmosphere of one another's existence without quite determining when that happened. When the formal part of the evening concluded and the guests moved to a small supper, Violet slipped away. She went down the hall to the Duchess's library, smaller than Ashmore's, more personal, in beautiful disorder, and she stood among the books and breathed. She heard his footstep in the doorway. "How are you?" he said. Intact, she said, which is the most honest answer. He came in. He stood beside her, looking at the books, and for a moment they were simply two people in a library, which was where, she thought, they had always been most themselves. "There is something I want to ask you," he said. She turned. He was holding something. A ring, not ostentatious, not the grand theatrical proposal ring of romantic fiction. It was a small, precise thing, an oval of deep green tourmaline set simply in gold, the color of a bottle-glass window with light behind it, the color of her dress at the musicale. "This was my mother's," he said. She had it made because she thought the Ashmore jewels were too large to be used on a Tuesday. She wore it most days. He paused. "I do not have a speech prepared. I find I distrust speeches in this context. I have a question." She waited. "I have made enormous errors," he said. "I have built 15 years on a wound and used the building as a weapon and hurt people I should have protected. I do not offer you a clean history because I do not have one. I offer you honesty. Always. For the rest of my life, everything that is true, even when it costs me. I offer you the cottage back, which is already done, and your father's name restored, which will be complete by next week, and my best effort to be the kind of person you could. Not overlook the past of, but look forward with." He held the ring and looked at her. "Violet Ashworth," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. The honest face, the face behind the iron. She thought about the letters, which she was still angry about, and the grey volume on the shelf, and the way he had stood close enough to lean on at Marshalsea, and not touched her, and the way he had told her she was extraordinary in Mare's drawing room, without making it sound like a compliment, more like a fact he was annoyed not to have noticed sooner. "Yes," she said. "Not, I suppose, not under these conditions, not with a list of provisos, just the word itself, straight and clean." "Yes," she said, "I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fitted as if it had been made for her, which she did not say aloud, because it was the kind of observation that could tip into sentiment. And she was not, quite yet, ready to be fully sentimental in a library. "I am still angry about the letters," she said. "I know," he said. "You will be hearing about it for some time. I expect I will hear about it until I am quite old," he said, "which is the correct consequence." She laughed. It was not a small, polite laugh. It was a real one. Full and warm and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has spent 3 years being careful and is temporarily in a library on a November night with a ring on her finger, not careful at all. He smiled. The full smile, the one that erased 15 years. It was a remarkable thing to see. She kissed him this time without being asked, because it was her occasion and she would do things in her own order. 3 days later, she sat at her writing desk. Her desk in her rooms, though the designation of her rooms was in the process of being renegotiated, as part of a wider renegotiation that she found unexpectedly delightful. And she took out a sheet of paper. She did not take out the locked journal. She did not take out the bundle of unsent letters tied with the blue ribbon. She took a fresh sheet of good cream paper, the kind that deserved to carry something real, and she dipped her pen and she wrote. This letter she sent. "My dear father, I am writing to tell you that I am well, not in the careful way I have been saying so for 3 years, performing wellness for your comfort, but genuinely and substantively well, in a way that I did not know how to be when I last saw you. I am engaged to be married. I will not burden you with the whole of the story, since you were present for many of its stranger chapters, and I suspect that you, with your talent for reading between lines, have pieced together the essentials. I will tell you only this. He is not simple, and neither am I. and the history between our families is not a thing that can be erased, but it is a thing that can be reckoned with, honestly, by two people willing to do the reckoning. I believe that is what we are doing. He read my letters, Father. I want you to know I have not forgiven this fully. I am working on it. He knows I am working on it. This seems to me a reasonable arrangement. The cottage is returned to you. It is yours officially, as of Monday next. I do not know whether you will want to live there, or whether the life you rebuild will take you somewhere else entirely. Only that the choice is yours now, which is the only important thing. I have been thinking, since everything that has happened these past weeks, about what we might take from it, not for the purposes of avoiding the pain. I do not think pain is a thing one should be in the business of avoiding, since it is too often the price of having loved something worth loving, but for the purposes of understanding it. I think the lesson is this, that a wrong done in the name of justice is still a wrong. That grief, when it is not examined, becomes a weapon in hands that should be healing, that the documents of our lives, the ledgers, the letters, the instruments we use to define what is owed and by whom, can be falsified by people whose interest is served by our conflict, and that the only defense against this is to look, always, at the actual person in front of you, rather than the record of them you have been handed. Adrian looked at me as though I were someone worth knowing before he ever saw my face. He knew me from my letters and he came to find me. That he had also caused my situation does not make the finding less real. I have decided to hold both things at once, the wrong and the reckoning, and to call that not forgiveness but something more durable, which is understanding. I find I am not afraid anymore, Father. Not in the bone-deep way I have been for 3 years. I find that the light in the mornings is exactly the right color, and that London is not, it turns out, entirely indifferent, and that I am precisely the size I am supposed to be. Come to London when you are ready. There is a library that needs a second opinion on its cataloguing system, and I know you have quarrels with Johnson's dictionary that have been waiting to be aired. With all my love, and more of it than I have known how to say. Your violet P.S. the roses on the south wall of the cottage. Please do not tear them out. They have been there longer than any of us, and they have survived worse. She sealed the letter. She addressed it. She put it in her satchel. Then she went downstairs, into the library, where Adrian was sitting in the chair by the window reading. Spectacles on, sleeves rolled up, the unconscious inhabitation of a person comfortable in a space. And she sat in her chair, and she opened her own book, and she was quiet, and he was quiet, and the library was full of the warm, sufficient peace of two people who have stopped running from each other. The afternoon light came in at exactly the right angle. It always had, and that, my friends, is where we leave them. In a library, where they both, in different ways, always lived. I want to take a moment before we close to say something to you directly, because this story was about more than a Regency romance, and I think you know that. There is a lesson in Violet's life that is worth naming. She spent 3 years making herself small by necessity, and she survived it, and she came through it not diminished but clarified. Knowing herself more completely, because she had been stripped of every external thing that might have obscured the essential her. Her intelligence, her passion, her honesty, her absolute refusal to be extinguished. None of those things were given to her by circumstance. They were her. They would have been hers in any dress, any room, any level of fortune. And there is a lesson in Adrian's, which is harder to say, and perhaps more important. He spent 15 years building his life around a wound and calling the building justice. The wound was real, the grief was real, but grief that is not examined becomes a weapon, and weapons do not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. He hurt the wrong person. He acted on manufactured evidence because it confirmed what his grief needed to be true, and the correction of that error did not erase the harm. It required facing it, acknowledging it, and doing the long, costly work of making it right. The education in this story is this: know your own grief. Examine your certainties. Look at the actual person in front of you, not the record of them you have been handed. And when you have been wrong, not wrong in the small way of ordinary mistakes, but wrong in the way that costs another human being their life, their freedom, their family, the response is not self-flagellation, and it is not erasure. It is honesty, and then action, and then the patient, humble work of repair. And to Violet, to every Violet, wherever she is reading or listening, you are not smaller than the world requires you to be. You are exactly the size you are supposed to be. The right person will look at you and see not a problem to be managed, but a presence to be known. That is worth waiting for. If you have been here for this entire story, in London with Violet, in the library with Adrian, outside Marshalsea watching a father walk back into the light, then you are exactly the listener this channel exists for. Subscribe if you have not. Leave us a comment telling us which moment stayed with you, or where in the world you are listening from tonight. We are not done yet. More stories are coming, the kind that cost something to tell and something to hear. Until then, good night. End a note on the moral architecture of this story. 2 lessons, stated for those who want them plainly. 1. Do not let grief become a blueprint. Grief is real, and grief is valid, and grief demands to be felt. But grief that is never examined will eventually write your story for you, and it will not write it honestly. Examine your certainties, test your evidence. Love justice enough to apply it to yourself. 2. You cannot be invisible forever, and you should not want to be. The world needs the mute, inglorious Miltons. Gray was right about that, but only needs them to be silent, not absent. Be present, take up the space that belongs to you. The right people will not find it too much. Both of these things are harder than they sound. Both of them are worth trying.